So today we're going to talk about organizational theory and development. So we're going to be going back to some of the ideas in this particular lecture set that we talked about right at the start of the semester. So we're going to be talking about, again, thinking about how to visualize or frameworks for exploring problems within organizations as a whole. So a lot of industrial organizational psychology is more focused on the individual, the group, the department, leadership. So there's a lot of kind of focusing on the smaller parts. Organizational theory and organizational development is the idea of looking at the entire organization and redesigning it. And industrial organizational psychology, drawing both from the I and the O side, very much focus on this idea of how do we describe organizations and how do we develop them. As always, make sure that you're keeping up with the expected readings and the various assignments that are due. So, organizational theory, we're going to first discuss organizational theory and the three main types of organizational theories that are out there. And when we say organizational theory, what we're really talking about is a kind of start point to look at organizations. So it's what are the assumptions that you're making about an organization before you start actually even trying to identify elements to work with. And then we're going to start talking about organizational development, the idea of consultants and or upper management looking at the entirety of an organization's functions, all the way from its most basic functions, its broad goals, and how it achieves those functions, and is it achieving those goals and functions, and how to redesign the organization at multiple levels. So really, organizational development often draws on many of the elements we've already talked about: better performance appraisal, better selection, better training, and targeted training. But instead of looking at these as individual interventions for one particular problem, it's more about an organizational level battle plan, if you will, of how to increase and to develop the entire organization. And it also will often draw from elements of organizational psychology that we're going to start discussing. So, organizational theory, a set of propositions that explains or predicts how groups and individuals behave in varying organizational structures and circumstances. So, like most definitions in psychology, we've got a lot packed into this definition. So, propositions, basically, that's start points, that's assumptions. So, it's a set of assumptions. And it's the assumptions that we're going to use to try to explain and predict how an organization functions. Specifically within that organization, how both individuals and groups behave and how that behavior can be affected by the actual organizational structure or circumstances. So this is a very top-down way of looking at improving organizations. So most of the methods we've been discussing so far have been more of bottom-up. Fix selection and things will get better. Fix your performance appraisal systems, things will get better. It's ideas of individual interventions that will have a long-term result in increasing the likelihood of the organization attaining its goals and also the productivity of that organization. This is looking at it from top down. Can we change the entire organization structure or the environment of that organization, and by doing so result in increasing productivity below that change? So there's three broad types we're going to talk about as far as organizational theories, and actually all of these to some degree are still used today. We're going to once again return to the idea of classical organizational theory, often referred to as scientific management or Theory X. And it should be noted that you can't ignore classical organizational theory. There's definitely some problems with it. It's a fairly cold way to look at an organization, but to some degree there does need to be basically evidence-driven management. There needs to be clear structures within organizations, and there also needs to be clear procedures of how do you motivate employees directly. In other words, how do you set up an organization where the structure will result in people performing well, no matter what, and that the reward systems will result in performance. That's more classical organizational theory. We're going to talk about humanistic theory. Humanistic theory is basically that theory Y. So the theory Y says that, well, it's not necessarily an alternate. It isn't saying that classical organizational theory is wrong. It says that classical organizational theory is just the starting point. And once you set up a system, a bureaucracy, if you will, a hierarchy of scientific management, once you put in place reward systems to try to increase the likelihood that anyone will perform well in the organization, you then need to start treating people as people. You need to start coming up with ways to also make sure that they're self-motivated, that they're satisfied with their jobs, that they're loyal to and committed to their organizations. And finally, there's open systems theory, which we've again discussed and you talked about in the first of your paper projects. The open systems theory, we're going to come back to that and talk about it a little bit more in detail now about how we look at open systems theory to guide our decision making. A person that's doing organizational development should honestly be looking at all three of these. What is the hierarchy and reward structure of an organization? Mainly drawing from classical organizational theory. What is the environment? What's it like to be an employee in this organization? It can be made more pleasant, humanistic theory. And finally, what is the open systems? What are the inputs, the throughputs, and the outputs, and the structure of the organization in the way that it actually produces and obtains its goals? So scientific management, that's again our first type, our classic organizational theory. So the approach is to conduct studies and gather data, indicating a most efficient method to get things done, and then implement that method. So scientific management is about efficiency. It does look at workers, to some degree, as cogs in a machine. But the purpose is how do we make the work environment as safe as possible and as efficient as possible? So there's four main principles that management gathers data from workers who are in the best position to understand the job. So this is important. The idea of scientific management, classic organizational theory, behind it all is the idea of using the scientific method to do management. And the first part of the scientific method is that idea of observation. That empiricism, the actual observation of data, is the best way to gather information and to learn about the world. So one of the first principles of scientific management is that a part of managers' jobs is to gather data about how their jobs are being done. It includes the principle that workers should be selected scientifically and trained to be more efficient than ever before. So again, selection is a major part of scientific management. There should be data-driven selection tools that have been found to be related significantly to performance that are used to determine who actually gets hired. And once they're hired, they should again be scientifically measured to check their performance, to allow training to be used, and again, that training should be scientifically backed to increase that performance if needed. It's about the fourth principle, the scientific selection, data collection, and training are combined to enhance efficiency. That this should be a solid process of scientific selection. We use selection techniques that we know are reliable and do protect performance. Once someone is in, we start collecting data about their performance, and when we find a problem with that performance, we implement scientifically backed training to increase that performance. It also is about the fourth principle is the redistribution of work. Management takes over tasks previously left to workers. So the idea here is also that scientific management is about trying to make sure that each person has clearly defined roles. So basically, management is supposed to be doing all of this work. It shouldn't be done by the actual employees. Another major part of this idea of classic organizational theory is the bureaucracy. Major features of a bureaucratic organization is that division of labor. So employees are trained to do only particular tasks and duties. Managers have clearly defined tasks. Employees have clearly defined tasks. Upper management has clearly defined tasks. There's a very top-down structure. It's a hierarchical system of supervision. So as you move up the organization, you find less and less employees, and each employee has more employees under them that they manage. So literally think of it, at the very top you have the owner or the president of the company. And then below them is a small select group of, we'll call them vice presidents. Under each vice president might be a senior manager, a group of senior managers. Under each group of senior managers might be a line manager. Again, a multiple line managers. And finally, under each line manager is a larger group of employees. So it creates kind of a pyramid structure with very few people at the top, and at each level as you go down, you see more and more people. So there's also a chain of command, that there is decisions are being made at the top, but they're being filtered through multiple levels of management. There's a delegation of authority, assignment of particular tasks to employees, and they hold them responsible. So each one of those levels is delegating authority. What that means is that the president may set the actual overall goals for the organization. The vice presidents then might try to make those into actionable behaviors and action plans. Those are then sent to the senior management team to actually determine how that's going to look like on the floor, which is given to the line managers to actually implement, and then the line managers are telling the employees, this is what you need to do. Span of control is another major part of bureaucracy. It's the number of subordinates reporting to a given supervisor. And generally, again, for scientific management, you want to find what is the optimal span of control. In other words, what is the optimal number of employees that each level can manage? So can one senior manager also basically manage 7 line managers, or 5 line managers, or 20 line managers? Can each line manager manage 10 employees, 20 employees, 30 employees? There's a tendency towards a standardization of tasks. In other words, there is a one best way to get the job done, and that's how everyone is being trained. So there's one way to manage at each level, there's one way to do the job, and there's usually a very structured set of expectations with each job. And also a very centralized decision making. So again, related to that chain of command. Generally, each level of management has very clear knowledge of what decisions they can and cannot make, and what is effectively above their pay grade. So, scientific management starts with the idea that there should be a scientific background to how we manage, and that a manager's job partly is to become effectively a science manager. They're to collect data, they're to look for these relationships, they're to implement this kind of training. Unfortunately, a lot of times when we look at classical organizational theory, we also find that classical organizational theory strongly suggests the use of a bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy does work, especially in larger organizations that are fairly stable. So this idea of division of labor, top-down structure, delegation of authority, span of control, standardization of tasks, and centralized decision-making is one way to do business, one way to develop an organization. Organizational development, this is one way to do it. Unfortunately, the original idea of classic organizational theory was this was the only way to do it. And we found that though this works in some situations, it's also a fairly poor design in many. So that brings us to our second theory, humanistic theory. Explains organizational success in terms of employee motivation and interpersonal relationships. So again, this goes to the idea of the researcher McGregor from organizational theory came up with the variance between Theory X and Theory Y. That again, Theory X was the birth of industry to the mid-1900s, so basically 1930s through 1950s, and it was a traditional view of employees as lazy, selfish, not very intelligent, and it was management's job to control and direct those employees for profit. And Theory X is strongly driving that classical organizational theory or scientific management theory, that managers have to spend a lot of time gathering data, and they have to spend a lot of time creating structures to make sure performance happens. And that the bureaucracy, this very centralized decision-making through a series of spans of control, is the best way to make sure everyone's doing their job. The problem with Theory X is that it tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Over time, employees learn to act and believe in ways consistent with their managers. In other words, if you are never allowed to be self-motivated, if you're constantly being basically suspicion is constantly being leveled at you that you're not doing your job, you have a tendency to start behaving that way. So when Theory X is the main theory being used, you often will find, especially after a little bit of time, that employees do become lazy, selfish, and tend to not think for themselves. They tend to just be goaded by management. So here's an example of the self-fulfilling theory of Theory X and the cycle of it. So management assumes the worst of employees, the top of this chart. Management then treats employees with rigid control and without respect. Basically, everything is structured to force employees to work no matter what they feel like or how their response, and it's not really incorporating how they're feeling. It's basically creating rigid structures of you either do the job as required, the way we have it set out, or you'll be fired, and we will constantly be monitoring you to make sure that you're not failing. Employees respond fairly negatively to this shoddy treatment. There's a lot of suspicion. They know that management is simply there to catch them basically failing at the system. And employees become what management assumed they were as they act in accordance with those originally inaccurate assumptions. Basically, if you're going to force me to work, why would I ever try to work harder? I'm going to just do the bare minimum, which makes you then up at the top of the cycle. You assume the worst of your employees. See, all these employees are just doing the very minimum work. If we stopped watching them for a day, nothing gets done. They have to be watched. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. So McGregor suggested a different approach was needed for organizational development. And I really want to stress again that Theory X is probably in most situations a poor way to manage. But that doesn't mean that the other parts of classical organizational theory, the idea of scientific management, and even bureaucracy in some situations, is bad. It just means that if your only theory is Theory X, and your only way of doing things is scientific management with bureaucracy, there's going to be a lot of situations where that's not going to work as well. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use an old expression. There are some good elements in classic organizational theory that we do want to still take into account when we're trying to do organizational development. We just want to be careful that we're not communicating a Theory X approach to management while using those elements. So Theory Y, again, emphasizes the inherent goodness, capacity, and potential of employees, along with their readiness to develop, emphasize management responsibilities for providing employees with opportunities to develop. So the emphasis here is not on management as basically taskmasters who are constantly forcing employees to perform. The emphasis is on management actually providing employees with the tools they need to do their job well and to develop. Now, I should also state that most research finds that Theory Y usually results in better performance in organizations. However, there are some situations where Theory X is still the better. If you have a very low-paid job, which doesn't have a lot of advancement, there isn't very much development, it's basically, this has to be done for our company to produce whatever we're producing. There really isn't a way to make this economically a more enjoyable job. At that point, Theory X, assuming your employees have to be somewhat forced and watched to actually perform, might be the better theory to use. But most situations, especially if there's some economic latitude in how the job is done, if the job could be actually a little more creative and more complex jobs, Theory Y is usually a much better theory to go for. So our final theory I want to talk about is open systems theory again. So again, just as a reminder, this was Katz and Can, 1978, really suggested this, but various components of open system theory have been out there much longer than that. So the idea is that an organization does develop and change over time as a result of both internal and external focuses. And again, there's these three key components: the inputs, raw materials, human resources, energy, machinery, location, the raw materials necessary for the company to exist. There's the throughputs. That's the actual production process, service process, training process, everything that occurs within the organization that turns inputs or combines inputs in something that the company can actually produce. And that's the output. It can be products, it can be service, it can be knowledge. And finally, we have that feedback cycle. The idea that based on these outputs, the environment that the organization exists in is both going to basically determine how well that product is treated, but we also need to look at the feedback to possibly change the inputs, throughputs, and outputs in a different direction. There's a couple of additional elements to open system theory we really haven't talked about before. The first one is the idea of negative entropy. Negative entropy refers to the fact that open systems theory assumes that if an organization is not developing and bringing in new inputs, it will naturally tend to die. So for an organization to exist, it's the same as an organism. If an organism stops eating, eventually it will stop to function. Same with an organization. So a business that stops bringing in inputs, stops bringing in new human resources, stops bringing in raw materials, is on a path towards entropy. It is on a path towards basically extinction. So an organization, by its very nature, should be constantly in motion, constantly bringing in new inputs, constantly doing throughputs, and constantly putting out outputs, and changing the kind of inputs, throughputs, and outputs it uses as the environment that it exists in changes. So if you think of any successful company that's existed for a long time, you'll see a history of changing products, changing inputs, and changing the way it does things. Very few organizations are doing the same things they did in the past. A good example of this actually is, it's in the news currently, Sony. So the company Sony actually started out as an electronics company, at least in the 70s and 80s, and one of its big hits was portable music. It made millions and, well, quite honestly, billions off of the Walkman, an idea of you can now take music and make it portable. However, today, Sony is mainly associated with film and media production. That's an example of they were one type of company, and at some point they realized we're losing market share. What we're producing, the idea of portable music has been, other companies have come along with better ideas. There's now MP3s, there's the iPod, and we just are behind the times. We need to shift the kind of business we do. If we want to stay moving, if we want to avoid negative entropy, we need to adjust our inputs, our throughputs, and our outputs to stay active and moving forward. Another key component of this is that feedback cycle, and that's a couple of things that we want to look at. First, does the feedback cycle actually provide information that is useful to determine if the inputs, throughputs, and outputs need to be changed. And this is something an organization can basically do wrong, is what I'm trying to communicate. And that is that they need to be open to negative feedback. A lot of organizations just want to hear the positives about what they're doing. Well, that can lead to negative entropy. If you're only looking for the positives, the market can be changing around you and you're not going to recognize it. So that feedback cycle, and this is often a focus of organizational development. IO psychologists will sometimes come into organizations and go, your feedback cycle is set up to only give you positive information. You need to be seeking out the negative feedback of what is not liked about your products to really determine the future. Because it isn't just about, are you successful today? It's about, is this organization going to be successful in a year, 5 years, and 10 years? And that's adapting to the environment. And finally, the last thing I want to say before we finish on open systems is the idea of equal finality. So equifinality, basically equal final goals. There's many different ways for an organization to be successful. So there isn't just one way. That's what equifinality means, that there are many different equal ways to get to the goals that an organization wants. So if the goal is to become productive and to increase market share, there's many, many different ways an organization could adjust its inputs, throughputs, and outputs to get to that goal. And organizations need to be very open to changing their inputs, throughputs, and outputs in order to make sure they're always moving towards their goals.